sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor early in the morning?
Now that the chines are installed and the epoxy has had a chance to set up and cure, what I did is I went along the edges here and I planed them down. You just use a hand plane, block plane, jack plane. If you don't have a plane, you could use a belt sander. You can use a random orbital sander. You could use almost anything of that nature. You could take a some sandpaper wrapped around a block of wood and work your way down through the grits. But essentially what I did is I made the surfaces all flat, and that's because this will now be the mating surfaces for the bottom panel. So what I had to do is you're working your way down, take a straight edge, you put it across, and you make sure that you have flat surfaces all the way. You have matching flat surfaces. That way there you'll get a good bond with the bottom panel. And you work your way all the way to the stem. You can notice that it's flat across all the way down. That means I'll have a good seal. So once you get to this point, you have a fairly rigid hull. Now we just need to install the bottom. But we don't pre-cut the bottom. We just take a piece of plywood, we'll drape it over the top, we'll fasten it on one end, throw some weights down at the other temporarily, and then I'll just take a pencil, I'll run it around the bottom, then remove it, flip it upside down, and cut just outside the lines that I traced, and then fit it back in place and see how it looks. Okay, I've taken a partial sheet of 3/8 inch plywood, and this is an exterior, all of this plywood is exterior plywood, and the nicer face is on the outboard side, and the other side, not so nice, is on the inside. And that's not to make the boat pretty so much, it's because since there aren't any cracks or knots showing here, it's a lot easier to keep the water out, get a good tight seal. And on the inside, you can always fill that in with some epoxy resin mixed with some fillers and coat it, and it will seal. But you're better off doing that, not taking any chances. Have a nice smooth surface on the outside of the hull. And so now what I've done, I've simply clamped it down. This piece of plywood. It's the bottom is 3/8 inch. Clamped it at the stem. And when I looked under here, the plywood is tight against the bottom of the hull. So now all I have to do is take a pencil, and the back of the plywood is slightly overhanging the transom. I'll grind that, flush. I'll sand it flush later, just to make sure I have a little extra, and rather than starving it and having not enough plywood there. I'll take a pencil. I'm going to put it right up against the hull, and I'm just going to trace all the way around. Okay. I can go ahead and release the clamps now that I've traced it. And I don't know if this will show up on the camera, but I now have lines traced for the bottom panel. All I have to do is just cut that out, staying just a little bit outside the lines, and then we'll fit the bottom panel in similar fashion like I fit up all the other panels. I'm just going to cut this panel out freehand. Okay, I have a bottom panel that's rough cut. This is the inside face. I'm all ready now to begin fitting it up onto the boat. Well, before I start fitting the panel into place, what I did is I took a couple of scrap pieces of plywood and my bevel gauge, and I got this angle here of the transom in relationship to the bottom. And what I did is I cut a scrap of plywood, and you can see where it overhangs a little bit here. The plywood is 3/4 of an inch thick. This overhangs this flat piece by 3/8 of an inch. So when I draw a line across, it's going to be right in the middle where I put my screws. And I have it notched out right here because if you have any overhang, a little overhang you have, the notch will accommodate that overhang. What this allows me to do is it allows me to take my pencil, and I can run my pencil right up against it as I move along, and I can have a pencil line once I have this clamped down in place. I did the same thing for the sides. I used the main frame, the angle of the side panel in relationship to the main bottom of the main frame, and I made this one. So it's going to be a little bit different angle. One of the big differences is that you have to allow for the thickness of the side panel, which is 1/4 of an inch. So since the chine is 3/4 of an inch thick, and we want half of that, 3/8, we just add 2 more eighths. We have a 5/8 overhang, notch, and the proper angle. When the plywood is in place, and it's overhanging a little bit because I cut outside the lines, I can put that and run right along like this with my pencil, and now I know where to put the screws. And because I also made this, the end of this piece of wood, the same angle that I have against the side panel, I know the angle to hold my drill. I use that as a guide when I want to hold my drill to drill my holes. So that way there I won't have any screws come sticking out outside the chine on the inside of the boat. Okay, you can see me just running the pencil along here. I don't know if you can see the pencil mark, but the pencil mark is going to tell me where to drill my holes for the screws. Well, I have to apologize because when I was placing the bottom on, measuring out for where the screws are going to go, drilling and installing the bottom, the little SD card in the camera was full, and the camera clicked off, and I didn't realize it. And so this whole procedure of getting this bottom on, I lost. So I'm sorry about that. But you didn't miss a whole lot. Basically, I fit the panel just like I did the other panels. You saw me a little bit measuring where I was going to drill holes, drilling and countersinking holes, putting in the screws, basically installing the bottom, screwing it in place. I then went around and I ground down the sides, planing and grinding, sanding, until I had it all fit up. Then I removed all the screws, took the bottom off, cleaned up all the wood chips and sawdust, and then I went around and I went ahead and I glued all around the bottom, those flat surfaces where we installed the chine logs, made everything flat. That was all. Spread glue everywhere. Put the bottom back on, screwed it back down, and once that was done, I went ahead and I did some finish sanding and rounded the edges, and I filled in all the screw holes and sanded them flush. So that's what you had missed. But that's it. It wasn't really a big deal. The reason why I rounded over the edges here along the chine, along the bottom, is because now I want to put some protective fiberglass tape. Now, this boat will be watertight, but the reason I'm putting fiberglass tape is because with plywood construction, the edges of the plywood will tend to splinter and chip when they hit something. So this just provides a nice protective layer. It has a lot of abrasion resistance, and that'll help. It's a lot more work because once you put on the fiberglass tape, then you have to fair it into place. This fiberglass tape that I'm using, this is a 10-ounce fiberglass cloth. They say tape, it doesn't have any adhesive on it, it's just a fiberglass cloth, and the edges are finished so that it doesn't unravel. And it comes in a roll like this, a 50-yard roll. And this happens, the heaviness of the cloth, of the thickness, is classified by weight. This is called 10-ounce cloth, which is a little heavier than I would normally use for a small boat this size. I'd rather have 6-ounce cloth, but I don't have any. I do have this 10-ounce cloth, so I'm going to use it. This is about 4 inches wide, which is okay. Larger boats, I usually use a 6-inch wide cloth, but 4 inches is fine for the small dinghy. And so it's going to be half and half, 2 inches, 2 inches. And what I do is I measure it out and I cut it beforehand, before I commit myself to any resin. And so I have the length and I have across the transom. That will protect the edges of the plywood. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix up some resin. Now, it doesn't really matter so much. You can use epoxy resin, you can use polyester resin. Epoxy resin is superior, but it's also much more expensive. Polyester resin is a little bit cheaper, but you have a little bit less working time. It's not quite as strong, but for a small dinghy, you're fine. It should work fine on this. So I have resin already mixed in containers, not mixed, but in containers ready for the hardener. Once I mix the hardener, I'm on a time crunch because it'll set up pretty fast, so I have to work quickly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a throwaway chip brush, and I'm going to take the resin that is already mixed, and I'm going to wet out the area where I'm going to put the fiberglass tape. Once the fiberglass tape is wet out, I will then lay the glass tape over and I'm going to smooth it out, and what will happen is that resin will provide a tacky surface for the tape to stick to. Otherwise it'll just fall off and it makes it difficult to work with. It also gives a chance to get some resin to help soak into the wood a little bit if you get a little bit better bond. Some people just put the glass tape on, start soaking it out. I like to go this way, a little bit better. It's easier for me. You can do it any way you want. The best thing to do is just follow manufacturer's recommendations. And then once it's wet out, I go back over with more resin. And what I'll do is I'll pour a little resin on, or maybe brush it on the surface of the tape. And what I'll do is I'll take a squeegee, like a automotive Bondo type squeegee, and I will spread the resin evenly over the glass tape. The glass tape will become translucent, and what I want to do is, if there are any air bubbles, you'll see them right away, and you want to work the air bubbles out. You want to work them to the outside, get rid of all air bubbles, make sure you have a nice solid bond. Then I just let it set up. Once it's set up, I want to wash off. There's a wax that comes to the surface. This is a waxed resin I'm using. You want to wash off that wax with a solvent. A lot of times hot soapy water will work. Sometimes you need a different solvent. Just read the can, what it tells you. And once that's washed off and it's cured, you can go ahead and you can start sanding, and you can add fillers, and you can fair the tape into the hull so you don't even know that it's there. You won't even see it. So that's what I'm going to start doing right now.